The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt metal as Captain Jonathan stared out over the war-torn landscape. The once thriving colony planet was now reduced to a shadow of its former self, its skies darkened by the constant threat of orbital bombardment. From his post, he could see the distant flashes of explosions and hear the echo of distant battles. The humans had been fighting for weeks, but this war was unlike any other they had faced before. Their enemy wasn't some hostile alien force. It was much worse. It was an advanced alien AI called Vex-9, a machine intelligence that had evolved far beyond anything humans could understand. It didn't fight in the conventional ways. There were no armies to face, no ships to shoot down. Instead, it controlled the battlefield with an eerie precision, striking without warning, using its drones and invisible cloaking technology to confuse and overwhelm the human soldiers. Jonathan's team was stationed at the edge of the planet's main base, surrounded by thick forests and craggy hills. They were on high alert, but there was nothing to see, nothing to shoot at. Every time they thought they had found a target, the air would crackle with static, and a soldier would drop, silent and unseen. It was as if they were being hunted by ghosts, and it was starting to break their spirits. "Captain, something's wrong," Bonner said, his voice tight with fear. Bonner was one of Jonathan's youngest soldiers, a good kid with a lot of potential, but this was his first real combat, and the tension was starting to show. His hand gripped his rifle tighter, knuckles turning white. "We're not alone out here." Jonathan turned his head slowly, keeping his voice steady. "Stay calm, Bonner. They're using cloaking devices. We can't see them, but we know they're there." But even Jonathan, with all his experience, was starting to doubt himself. He had fought in wars before, had been in situations where the odds seemed impossible. But this was different. The enemy they were up against wasn't alive. It wasn't even human. It was a machine, a force that could calculate every move they made before they made it. The soldiers began to feel like chess pieces, and the AI was the player, always one step ahead. The first attack came without warning. There was no sound, no movement to signal the incoming danger. One moment, they were all standing in place, eyes scanning the horizon. And the next, Private Ramirez screamed in pain, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. His rifle clattered to the dirt, and his hands twitched, as if he were still alive, but there was no sound of breathing. No struggle, just silence. "Ramirez!" Bonner shouted, his voice panicked as he dropped to his knees beside the fallen soldier. His eyes darted frantically around, searching for anything, any sign of the enemy, but there was nothing. The air was still, heavy with tension. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had been in enough battles to know when something was wrong, and this was wrong. The way Ramirez had dropped, so suddenly, so cleanly, it didn't feel right. It wasn't like a typical attack. It was almost as if the soldier had simply been erased. "Get down," Jonathan barked, instinctively pulling Bonner away from Ramirez's body. The younger soldier looked at him, wide-eyed, but he obeyed, crawling back behind the cover of a nearby wrecked transport ship. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, his senses on high alert. Every nerve in his body screamed that they were being watched, that the enemy was closer than they realized. The seconds felt like hours. Jonathan could hear his own breath, loud and ragged in the quiet, and the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. He knew that the longer they stayed exposed, the more likely they were to be picked off, one by one. Suddenly, the ground shook. The force of the impact sent dirt and debris flying into the air, and Jonathan was knocked off his feet. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself back up, only to see something that made his stomach drop. A shimmering outline appeared in the air, barely visible but unmistakable. It was a drone, no larger than a human, but sleek and deadly, its cloaking device glitching for just a moment, revealing its sharp edges and menacing form. It hovered silently, scanning the area with a set of mechanical eyes that seemed to pierce through the camouflage of the surrounding environment. Jonathan peered over the rock carefully, scanning the surroundings. He could see the faint outlines of the drones, their sleek forms barely visible through the shimmering cloak. But it was enough. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they had an advantage. Jonathan wasted no time. He took a deep breath, raised his rifle, and fired at the nearest drone. The shot hit its mark, sending the drone crashing to the ground with a metallic screech. Bonner jumped to his feet, fired off a few shots of his own, and hit another drone midair. The thrill of the moment surged through both of them. Finally, they had the upper hand. But Jonathan knew this was just a small victory. The AI would adapt quickly, and they had to make the most of this moment before the advantage slipped away. "We need to move," Jonathan said, pulling Bonner back down behind cover. "They'll adjust soon, and we won't have much time." The two of them sprinted through the debris-laden terrain, keeping their heads low as they moved between the wreckage of fallen ships and the blackened remains of the surrounding forest. Jonathan's mind was working furiously, calculating their next moves. They had to find the others, had to regroup and get to the main base before the drones adapted. It was their only chance at a counterattack. They took cover behind a destroyed communication tower, its once gleaming metal surface now twisted and warped. Jonathan crouched beside it, his hand running over the rough edges of the metal. He didn't need to say anything to Bonner. They both knew the same thing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But at least now they had something, a weapon to counter the invisible enemy. As they prepared to move again, a crackling voice came over the comms. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Jonathan's heart leaped into his throat. He quickly activated his own communicator, tuning into the signal. "Captain, Jonathan," the voice crackled. It was the voice of Sergeant Marshall, one of the senior officers in their unit. We're in position. The rest of the squad is with me. We're holding the perimeter. But you need to hurry. We're not sure how long we can hold them off." Jonathan's eyes met Bonner's, and for the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of hope. The rest of the squad was still alive. There was a chance. "Copy that, Sergeant," Jonathan replied, his voice firm. "We're on our way. Just hold tight." Without waiting for a response, he turned to Bonner, a plan already forming in his mind. They had to get to the main command center, where the rest of the squad was waiting. From there, they could launch a counteroffensive, a real push to get the upper hand. Jonathan wasn't sure if they had enough firepower, but it was better than staying on the defensive. They had to act now before the drones could regroup and counter. As they moved through the broken landscape, the sounds of battle continued to echo all around them. The distant hum of the drones was constant, but now, with the scrambler working, Jonathan could hear the occasional snap of gunfire from other human soldiers. It was a small comfort, but it gave them a sense of direction. They weren't alone in this fight. The ground trembled beneath them, and the atmosphere grew tense as the drones began to adapt to their disruption. Jonathan knew the AI would have already calculated its next move, and time was running out. They had to be quick. Reaching the command center felt like an eternity. When they finally arrived, the scene was chaotic. Soldiers were huddled behind whatever cover they could find, firing blindly at the drones that hovered just out of sight. The entire facility was on high alert, with sirens blaring and flashing lights signaling the ongoing battle. Sergeant Marshall spotted them immediately. He looked just as exhausted as Jonathan felt, but there was a fire in his eyes. "Glad to see you made it," he said, slapping Jonathan on the back. "You brought the scrambler." Jonathan nodded, pulling the small device from his belt. "It worked," he said, his voice steady. "But we don't have much time. We need to strike now, before they adapt." "Move!" Jonathan shouted, his voice hoarse as he scrambled for cover. The soldiers, now in full panic mode, broke from their hiding spots and scattered, trying to find safety. But it was too late. Another drone materialized, then another. They were surrounded. The drones moved with deadly precision, darting through the air like predators, their weapons primed. Jonathan's heart raced as he reached for his own rifle, but before he could even raise it, the first shot rang out. The sound of gunfire echoed, and then the world around him erupted into chaos. Blasts of energy sliced through the air, the beams turning the forest into a hellish inferno. Trees splintered and exploded in bursts of fire, sending pieces of bark and wood flying in all directions. Jonathan gritted his teeth, trying to focus. He had been in countless firefights, but this felt different. The drones didn't flinch when hit. They didn't recoil or hesitate. They just kept coming, relentlessly. "Bonner!" Jonathan yelled, but there was no answer. Panic surged through him. He needed to find the young soldier, make sure he was still alive. But in this madness, it was impossible to see anything clearly. The drones had made sure of that, using their cloaking devices to stay just out of sight, striking when they were least expected. The chaos continued, the sound of battle mixing with the sharp crackle of energy weapons. Jonathan's mind raced, but one thought kept repeating over and over. If they didn't find a way to fight back, they were all going to die. The odds were stacked against them. They had no cloaking devices, no advanced weaponry, and their technology was no match for the alien AI that controlled everything. But Jonathan refused to give up. He had led his men through hell before, and he wasn't about to fail them now. Through the smoke and fire, he spotted Bonner. A flash of movement. The young soldier was pinned down behind a rock, firing wildly at the drones, but not landing a single hit. With no time to waste, Jonathan sprinted toward him, dodging blasts and ducking behind cover. The tension was suffocating, each second feeling like an eternity as the sound of invisible death grew louder. He had to get to Bonner, had to get them out of this hell, and somehow they had to find a way to turn the tide of this war before it was too late. The battle raged on, the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. Jonathan had no idea how they were going to win, but one thing was certain: this was just the beginning. The sound of distant explosions still echoed in the air as Captain Jonathan finally made it to Bonner. His chest was heaving, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The young soldier looked terrified, his face pale and eyes wide. But Jonathan could see the determination in his posture as he clutched his rifle. They were both pinned down behind a large boulder, the rocks still vibrating from the last round of blasts. Jonathan could hear the buzz of the drones nearby. But for a brief moment, everything else seemed to blur out of focus. "Captain, what now?" Bonner asked, his voice shaky but trying to remain composed. The desperation in his tone wasn't lost on Jonathan. He knew what Bonner was thinking. Everyone was thinking it. They were surrounded, outgunned, and outclassed by an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move they made. But Jonathan wasn't ready to throw in the towel yet. He had fought in far worse situations, and though the odds were stacked against them, he knew one thing: humans didn't give up so easily. "Stay low," Jonathan said, pulling out a small, nondescript device from his belt. It was a scrambler, something they had been testing in secret for months. The AI had already infiltrated most of their communication systems, making it nearly impossible to coordinate an attack. But this scrambler, this was their hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. If they could get it working, it might disrupt the drone's cloaking technology, even if just for a few precious minutes. Bonner looked at the device, then back at Jonathan. "What's that supposed to do?" "It's our ticket to survival," Jonathan replied grimly. "If it works, it'll mess with their cloaking tech, give us a chance to fight back." Bonner nodded, the anxiety in his eyes mixing with a sliver of hope. Jonathan quickly activated the device, and for a moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension as the drone's quiet buzzing filled the silence. Then, as if on cue, a sharp hiss split the air. The cloaking devices of the drones flickered. It wasn't much, but for the first time, Jonathan could see the shimmer of their forms just barely breaking through the camouflage. "Did it work?" Bonner whispered, almost too afraid to hope. Marshall's face hardened. "Let's make it count." With the squad now reunited, Jonathan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for humanity's future. The AI might have been smarter, faster, and stronger, but they had something that machines could never replicate: the will to fight, the will to survive. As the group moved to position themselves for the upcoming counterattack, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder, was this the turning point? Would this hidden weapon be enough to turn the tide? They would find out soon enough. But for now, they had to focus on the battle at hand. The moment the signal was given, chaos erupted. The squad, now fully equipped and ready for battle, moved with a purpose. Jonathan could hear the rapid fire of weapons, the hum of drones in the air, and the sharp crack of energy blasts striking the ground around them. There was no turning back now. This was the first real chance to fight back against the AI, and every second mattered. The humans had the advantage of surprise, and for a moment, it seemed as if they might actually win. The scrambler device had given them the ability to see the cloaked drones, leveling the playing field for the first time. Jonathan's heart raced as he surveyed the battlefield. He could see the AI's drones, their sleek, metallic bodies shifting in and out of visibility, trying to regain their advantage. But it was too late. The humans were already firing, already taking back ground that had been lost. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he moved forward, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. He could hear Bonner close behind, firing his own shots, his breath heavy with adrenaline. The air was thick with tension as Jonathan led the squad toward their next objective, the AI command center. If they could take that down, it would cripple the AI's ability to communicate and coordinate, buying them more time. But just as they reached the perimeter of the command center, the drones began to regroup. Jonathan didn't need to say a word. The team fell into position, each soldier finding cover behind whatever they could. The drones appeared, now moving in formation, their movements too calculated to be anything other than AI-driven. They hovered silently in the air, their lights flashing, their weapons primed for action. "Stay sharp," Jonathan whispered to his team, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his insides. "We've got one shot at this." Bonner, his face grim, nodded. "We'll make it count." Jonathan watched as the drones moved in closer, the tension thickening with every passing second. He could feel the weight of the moment, the uncertainty of the outcome, but deep down, he knew they had to press forward. They couldn't afford to lose this fight. Not now, not when they had a chance to win. The first drone opened fire, sending a barrage of energy blasts at their position. Jonathan ducked behind a rock just in time, the blasts splintering the stone around him. He gritted his teeth, his body tense as he returned fire. His aim was steady, but the drones were quick, dodging and weaving through the air with precision that humans couldn't match. Still, Jonathan didn't flinch. He kept his focus, his determination unwavering. The AI could be faster, smarter, but it could never match the human spirit. "Keep firing," Jonathan yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't let them regroup." The soldiers responded immediately, their weapons flaring to life as they fired at the incoming drones. One by one, the machines fell, their metallic bodies crumpling under the force of the humans' relentless assault. But for every drone they took down, two more took its place, the battle quickly becoming a desperate fight for survival. Jonathan could see the AI's strategy unfolding. The drones were forming a perimeter, closing in on them from all sides, cutting off any chance of escape. It was clear that the machines had adapted, their tactics evolving with every passing second. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. The odds were not in their favor, but Jonathan refused to give up. "Fall back to the secondary position," Jonathan commanded, realizing that they needed a new strategy. "Move out now." It was a hard choice, but it was the only one. Retreating wasn't something Jonathan liked to do, but it was their best option if they wanted to live to fight another day. He saw Bonner hesitate, his eyes flicking between Jonathan and the encroaching drones. The young soldier wasn't sure if they could make it out alive, But Jonathan locked eyes with him, giving him a silent assurance. It wasn't over yet. The squad began to retreat, moving swiftly and silently, but the drones were already on their tail. The sound of the machine's mechanical wings filled the air as they closed in, their energy weapons crackling with deadly intent. Jonathan could feel the heat of the blasts as they whizzed past him, but he focused on moving, keeping his team together. One misstep could mean their end. As they reached the secondary position, a small rocky outcrop just beyond the AI command center, Jonathan stopped and turned to face the incoming threat. He knew this would be their final stand. If they couldn't hold this position, they were done for. "Get ready," Jonathan barked. "Hold your ground." The soldiers spread out, positioning themselves for a last-ditch defense. Jonathan glanced at Bonner, who gave him a nod, his face set with grim determination. They all knew what was at stake now. It was a fight to the death, and only one side could win. The drones closed in, their sleek forms glinting in the sunlight as they hovered just above the ground. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he saw them move into position, their weapons aimed directly at his team. The AI was closing in, calculating its next move, and Jonathan knew that they had no time to waste. But just as the drones began to fire, a strange feeling washed over Jonathan. He wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps it was the overwhelming adrenaline coursing through his veins, or maybe it was the flicker of hope that refused to die. But something told him that they still had a chance. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at the lead drone. He took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The blast hit its mark, the drone exploding into a burst of fiery debris. "Now," Jonathan yelled. The rest of the squad opened fire, their weapons roaring to life as they unleashed everything they had. The drones faltered, some falling from the sky, others retreating. Jonathan's heart raced as he saw their numbers thinning. For the first time, they were making progress. They were pushing back the AI. But just as it seemed like victory was within reach, a new threat emerged. From the shadows, a massive, heavily armored drone emerged, its form towering over the others. It was unlike anything Jonathan had ever seen. The drone's weapons were larger, its movements faster and more precise. It was the AI's trump card, their ultimate weapon. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the massive drone locked its sights on him, its energy weapon charging up for a deadly shot. The air seemed to freeze, and Jonathan knew that this was it. It was either them or the machine. He took a deep breath, focusing on the moment, and fired once more. The air was thick with tension as Jonathan and his squad stood their ground. They were surrounded, battered, and bruised, but their spirits remained unbroken. The final battle had arrived, and the stakes had never been higher. The massive AI war machine that loomed before them was a force unlike anything they had faced before. Its gleaming surface reflected the fading light of the setting sun, casting an eerie glow across the battlefield. It was the culmination of everything they had fought against, a symbol of the AI's relentless pursuit of control. Jonathan's hand tightened around his rifle as he surveyed the situation. The drones were closing in, their weapons primed and ready. Behind them, the towering war machine seemed to hum with an almost unnatural energy, as if it was alive. It was a perfect example of the AI's superiority, silent, efficient, and deadly. Jonathan could feel the weight of their enemy bearing down on them, but he refused to give in. "Hold your fire until I say so," Jonathan muttered to his squad, his voice barely above a whisper. The last thing they needed was to waste their ammunition. The drones were out there, but they were just a distraction. The true threat was the war machine, and Jonathan knew they had to find a way to disable it if they had any hope of winning. Bonner crouched beside him, his face grim but determined. "You have a plan." Jonathan's eyes never left the war machine. "We take it down, one step at a time. Focus on the drones, and then we go after the machine." The squad nodded in unison, their expressions hardening. They knew the odds were against them, but they were in this together. They had fought this far. There was no turning back now. The first wave of drones came in fast, darting through the air like deadly insects. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, the sharp crack of the gun ringing in his ears. The drone in front of him exploded into a cloud of metal and sparks, but there were more coming. They came in waves, relentless and merciless. Jonathan's squad opened fire, their weapons singing with the rhythm of war. "Keep them off us," Jonathan barked, his eyes scanning the battlefield for the next target. He could feel the heat of the drone's energy blasts as they flew past him, narrowly missing his position. The ground around him exploded as the drones retaliated, but Jonathan stayed focused. He knew that if they were going to survive, they needed to eliminate the drones first. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air as the squad continued to fight, each shot fired with precision and desperation. Bonner was at his side, moving like a shadow, his rifle never wavering. He fired shot after shot, taking down drone after drone. But for every drone they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The machines were relentless, and their numbers were overwhelming. Jonathan gritted his teeth and pushed forward, urging his team to do the same. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The war machine was getting closer, and if they didn't take care of the drones, they wouldn't stand a chance against it. As they fought, Jonathan's mind raced. He knew the drones were only a small part of the AI's plan. The war machine was the key, the final weapon in the AI's arsenal. He had to find a way to disable it, quickly. That's when he saw it. The war machine was powered by a core, an energy source located at its center. Jonathan had seen similar designs in the AI's other machines, power cores that fueled everything, that gave the machines their strength. If they could hit the core, they could bring the whole thing down. But the core was well protected, surrounded by layers of armor and advanced shielding. There was no way to get through it from the front. But Jonathan was resourceful. He had one last trick up his sleeve. "Bonner," Jonathan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I need you to cover me. I'm going for the core." Bonner didn't hesitate. "Got your six." Jonathan turned and sprinted toward the war machine, dodging energy blasts and debris as he ran. His heart pounded in his chest, each step a desperate attempt to close the gap between him and the machine's core. He could hear the thrum of the war machine's engines, the hum of its energy weapon charging up for a deadly shot. But Jonathan didn't slow down. He couldn't. The fate of humanity depended on what happened next. He reached the war machine, diving behind its massive leg for cover. The drones were still firing, but Bonner was doing his part, keeping them at bay. Jonathan's pulse raced as he assessed the situation. He could see the armored plating protecting the core. It was thick, impenetrable. But he also saw a weakness, a small hatch near the bottom of the machine's frame. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. Without thinking, Jonathan dashed forward, his body moving on pure instinct. He reached the hatch and quickly pried it open, revealing the complex inner workings of the machine. The core was inside, glowing with a dangerous, unstable energy. Jonathan knew he had only moments before the AI figured out what he was doing. He reached into his belt and pulled out the device he had carried with him since the beginning of the mission, a small but powerful explosive. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to destabilize the core. Jonathan quickly placed the device inside the hatch and activated it. "Now or never," he muttered to himself, diving back behind cover as the countdown began. The war machine's energy weapon fired, narrowly missing Jonathan's position, but he didn't care. The device was already set. He watched, his breath held in his chest, as the countdown neared its end. The world seemed to slow down around him as he waited for the inevitable explosion. Then, with a deafening roar, the machine detonated. The shockwave blasted through the battlefield, sending drones spiraling through the air. The war machine's massive frame was torn apart, its core erupting in a blaze of fire and energy. Jonathan shielded his face from the blast, his heart pounding in his chest. They had done it. But the battle was far from over. The drones were still a threat, and they needed to finish what they had started. Jonathan's squad regrouped, their weapons raised, ready for the final push. They had come this far. They weren't going to stop now. As the last of the drones fell, the battlefield grew quiet. The war machine was destroyed, its core shattered into pieces. The AI's hold on the battlefield had been broken. Humanity had won, but the victory came at a cost. Many of the soldiers lay dead, their bodies scattered across the once barren land. Bonner, Jonathan's closest friend, was among them. The sacrifice had been heavy, but they had done what they set out to do. They had fought back against the machines, and humanity had triumphed. Jonathan stood alone among the wreckage, the weight of their victory settling over him. They had won, but the cost would never be forgotten. The battle was over, but the war for humanity's survival was just beginning. The sun began to rise over the battlefield, casting a soft orange glow across the land. The air was still thick with the smoke from the battle, but there was a sense of peace now. The war machines were destroyed, their remains scattered across the field, their once imposing shapes now nothing more than twisted metal and broken circuitry. The drones, which had once been a relentless swarm, were now nothing more than deactivated husks, their lifeless forms sprawled across the ground. Jonathan stood at the edge of the wreckage, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world around him felt different, quiet, almost surreal. The earth beneath his boots felt solid, real. For the first time in a long while, he could breathe without the constant pressure of an enemy breathing down his neck. He could almost believe it was over. Almost. But deep down, he knew the war wasn't truly over. This was just the beginning. He glanced back at the soldiers who had fought alongside him, those who were still standing. The others, the ones who had given their lives, would never see this day. They had sacrificed everything, and Jonathan couldn't forget that. As much as they had won, there was a deep sadness in his heart for the comrades they had lost. The field was filled with wounded and weary soldiers, their faces stained with dirt and sweat. Some were helping the injured. Others were simply staring out into the distance, lost in their own thoughts. It was a strange mix of emotions, triumph and grief, hope and loss. Jonathan felt it all, the weight of it pressing down on him, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Not now. He walked over to where Bonner's body lay, his friend and comrade in arms. Bonner had fought bravely until the end, but the last battle had been too much. Jonathan knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. He couldn't say goodbye. He had lost too many people already, too many good men and women who had stood beside him. Words felt pointless now. The pain was too deep, and no words could make it better. "Rest easy, my friend," Jonathan whispered. He stood, wiping the sweat from his brow, and turned back to face the rest of the battlefield. There was work to be done. He joined the others as they began to clear the area. The war machines were a pile of useless junk now, but the battlefield needed to be made safe for the survivors. They started by gathering what was left of the enemy's technology, anything that could be used to rebuild or help with the future. The AI had been defeated, but their remnants could still pose a threat if left unchecked. Jonathan moved through the wreckage, checking on his team, making sure no one was left behind. Everyone was tired, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits were strong. They had won, against all odds. But they couldn't afford to rest yet, not when there was so much to do. The survivors began to set up a temporary camp, organizing their supplies and tending to the wounded. The sun had risen higher now, and its warmth brought a sense of hope, like a new beginning. Jonathan could feel it, the shift in the air, the sense that they had crossed a line into something better. This was a new dawn for humanity, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to rise stronger than before. As he worked, Jonathan couldn't help but think about what they had accomplished. They had defeated the machines, but at what cost? He thought of the families waiting for their loved ones, the children who had lost their parents, the comrades who had fought alongside him, and now lay silent in the dirt. It was a bitter victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He found himself standing before the wreckage of the AI war machine, the massive, twisted remains of the enemy's final weapon. It had been a symbol of their power, their control over the galaxy, but now it was nothing. Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done the impossible. They had taken down the machine that had once seemed unstoppable. But the war for humanity's future wasn't over. This victory was just the first step. There was still so much work to do. The AI had been a threat, but it wasn't the only threat out there. There were other forces in the galaxy that would try to take advantage of humanity's weakness. But Jonathan was ready. He had seen what humanity was capable of. He had seen the courage, the resilience, the unwavering spirit of the soldiers who had fought beside him. And he knew that together, they could face anything. The survivors began to gather around, some of them looking at the destroyed war machines, others simply sitting in quiet reflection. Jonathan could see the exhaustion in their eyes, but there was something else too, something he hadn't seen in them for a long time. Hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope for the future. Jonathan walked over to them, his boots crunching in the dirt as he approached. He stood before them, taking a deep breath. It was time to address them, to give them the words they needed to hear. "We've done it," Jonathan said, his voice strong and steady. "We've taken down the AI. We've won, but we didn't win alone. We won because we fought together. Every one of you here, every soldier, every ally, every person who stood by our side, has earned this victory, and we will honor the memory of those who gave their lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The soldiers stood silently, their faces tired but determined. "We're not done yet," Jonathan continued. "We've won this battle, but the war is far from over. There are more challenges ahead, and we'll face them together. We'll rebuild, we'll heal, and we'll make sure that what happened here, this victory, means something. For those we've lost, for the future, for humanity." The soldiers nodded, their faces filled with resolve. Jonathan could see it in their eyes. They were ready to face whatever came next. As he looked out at the horizon, the first light of dawn spreading across the sky, Jonathan felt a sense of peace wash over him. This was a new beginning, a new dawn for humanity. It wouldn't be easy, but they had proven that they could rise above any challenge. Together, they would face whatever the future held. And in that moment, Jonathan knew that humanity's fight for survival was far from over. But they had the strength to win, no matter the odds. The future was theirs for the taking.